Hello, everyone. A few announcements before we begin. First off, please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent. So we have a few events this week that I want to remind you of. On Wednesday at 2 o'clock, we are screening the film Oppenheimer. And then on the 14th, we have a professor coming from the University of Ottawa, Gary Evans. He's going to talk about Oppenheimer and the race to victory. So watch the film and then come back for the discussion the following day, 2 o'clock. And then Friday, You've Got to Read This at 2 o'clock in the multipurpose room. There's going to be librarians presenting their latest favorite books for this year. So if you're doing your Christmas shopping, it's a good idea or Hanukkah shopping to come in and see which books we are reading and enjoying and we're recommending. And then next week, Tuesday, you must register. It's in celebration of Jewish Book Month. The Jewish Public Library Archives presents the Rosenberg Rhodolis, a Kabbalistic divinity map, which they will be bringing here in person and will also be streamed online, but they will bring this unique artifact. So please register for the 19th. And now, without further ado, here is Dr. Joe Schwartz with Science Demystified.
If you didn't see Oppenheimer, come see it. It's worth seeing. If you saw it, see it again, because you probably missed a lot the first time you saw it. All right. Anyway, the sun still did come up last Wednesday, right? The world still goes on. All right. Back in 1954, I had my tonsils out. And it was quite interesting because I had it out with chloroform. I remember this very well. The doctor spilled some chloroform on a piece of gauze, put it over my mouth and asked me to count backwards from 3 and probably never got to 2. Chloroform is very fast acting. Chloroform itself is a very interesting story. It was introduced by Dr. James Simpson, a Scottish physician, and this was, of course, back in the 19th century. And this happened after ether had been introduced in 1846 in the US. And because ether worked so well as an anesthetic, they tried many other things, inhaling various solvents. And Simpson and a couple of confreres in 1847 just tried inhaling all kinds of solvents and found that chloroform worked. Well, chloroform was really an excellent anesthetic. It is no longer used because chloroform is carcinogenic. Luckily, I had it before it was carcinogenic. But anyway, we have better anesthetics today. The chloroform is still used. It's actually the starting material for the making of Teflon, and all kinds of stories about Teflon today. Anyway, we won't worry about that, but chloroform is still used. Anyway, to get back to the story, after I had my tonsils out, I was told to eat lots of ice cream. And that, of course, is to soothe the throat, which becomes sore after the tonsils. And in those days, well, you know, many of you will remember this. If you had more than one tonsil infection, they would rip out your tonsils. That was the thing to do in those days. Today, in fact, it's very rarely done because tonsils are actually part of the immune system. So anyway, I had an aunt who lived in Montreal at that time, and she sent me a sample of aspergum after I had my tonsils out. This is a gum that you chew, and it releases aspirin. Now, aspirin, of course, already was well known as a pain reliever. It had been introduced in 1899 by the Bayer company. But aspergum was very interesting because it takes us to the first serendipitous discovery, which is what we're going to talk about today. A California physician by the name of Dr. Lawrence Craven was quite commonly using aspergum on his patients after removal of tonsils. And he noticed something. he noticed that the patients who chewed asparagum after having their tonsils removed bled more. Now, this was a very interesting observation. No one had made that observation before. He did. And he made the connection to aspirin, that maybe it was taking the aspirin that was causing the excessive bleeding. And he studied this in a number of patients, and then he wrote a paper on this, in fact, just a year before he died, which documented the fact that aspirin was linked to excessive bleeding. Now, this was a chance discovery, right? He had not been looking for this. It is what we would call a serendipitous discovery. And it wasn't until 1971 when John Vane in England explained the mechanism of how aspirin acts as an anticoagulant. We know this now. It interferes with some chemicals called prostaglandins. Anyway, for this, he received the Nobel Prize. And as you know, since that time, aspirin has been used prophylactically to try to prevent heart attacks. Now, it used to be that commonly men were told after the age of 65 or so to take a daily dose, small dose, 82 milligrams of aspirin as a preventative. This is no longer done because aspirin has another side. And that other side, of course, is that it can cause hemorrhage, it can cause bleeding. However, it is still used in someone who has risk factors and someone who has already had a heart attack. That's a different story, because there the benefits of preventing a second heart attack outweigh the risk of bleeding. So anyway, the use of aspirin prophylactically against heart attacks was a serendipitous discovery. But what does this mean, serendipitous? I mean, we all have a feeling for what that term means, sort of a lucky discovery, but where does it come from? The word serendipitous was actually introduced into the English language by Horace Walpole, English writer, and it was based on his having read the story, The Princess of Serendip. And this was a story written centuries earlier, and it told an account of the travels of these three princes who by accident and sagacity came upon some very interesting discoveries. Well, we would look at this as sort of lucky turn of events. However, what usually gets forgotten in connection with serendipity is the idea of sagacity, which really means using your intelligence to interpret what was a lucky observation. So it's not enough to make a lucky observation. You have to know what to do with it. So in this story, The Princess of Serendip, it's all about a camel salesman, and he loses one of his camels, and he doesn't know what happened to this camel. Well, the three princes of Serendip who meet up with the camel salesman and are told that he had lost the camel, immediately tell him that his camel was lame, blind in one eye, missing a tooth, carried butter on one side and honey on the other, and was ridden by a pregnant woman. This was astonishing, and the camel salesman was duly astonished because this was correct. How did this happen? Well, the princess had made an observation. Long before they heard about the lost camel, they had been traveling and they had seen some camel tracks. And based upon this, they came to the conclusion. When asked how they could possibly have come up with such an accurate description, the princess explained that grass had been eaten from the side of the road where it was less green, so the camel was blind on the other side, because there were lumps of chewed grass on the road the size of a camel's tooth. The princess inferred they had fallen through the gap left by the missing tooth. The track showed the prints of only 3 feet, the fourth being dragged, indicating that the animal was lame. That butter was carried on one side of the camel and honey on the other was evident because flies had been attracted to melted butter on one side of the road and ants to spilled honey on the other. There was also an imprint in the dirt from which they deduced the camel had knelt to let down a rider. Why was the rider a pregnant woman? There was some urine nearby and some handprints that suggested a woman had needed to use her hands to get up after urinating, her extra weight requiring a push. Yeah. Sounds like a conclusion or observations that Sherlock Holmes would have made, right? Well, I don't know if Sir Arthur Conan Doyle ever read The Princes of Serendip, but I think he would have been in tune with it, because of course Sherlock Holmes was based on the idea of making observations and coming to conclusions. So anyway, this idea of capitalizing on the chance observation that they had made and the conclusion they came to about the lost camel, I mean, this was an example of serendipity, but they were able to do something with it, right? They had made the lucky observation, but they were able to come to some conclusion. Louis Pasteur really put this well. In the field of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. And this is really going to be the theme of the stories that I'm going to tell you, because it's one thing to make an observation, and it may be a lucky observation, but it's useless unless you know what to do with it. And we'll have plenty of examples of this. And of course, because this is such a famous statement by Louis Pasteur, we will start with Pasteur. Well, Pasteur, of course, is famous for the germ theory of disease. He is regarded as one of the fathers of immunology or bacteriology. He was one of the first to recognize that microbes could cause disease. Well, one of the diseases that Pasteur was interested in was something called chicken cholera. And this was a disease that infected chickens on chicken farms, and it was transmitted from bird to bird, and it could wipe out flocks of chickens. So of course, this was a big issue for chicken farmers. And Pasteur thought that there was a good chance that this was a microbial disease. And he, in fact, discovered that this was the case, that if he took an infected chicken and took some of his blood and injected it into another chicken, the other chicken got sick. And under the microscope, it became clear that the blood was infected with various microbes. And so he was able to do this experiment to infect other chickens. But as you know, in science, one experiment doesn't mean anything. The first thing you have to do whenever you make some novel observation is to repeat it. So he wanted to repeat it. He had an assistant. The assistant was Charles-Édouard Chamberlain, and he was given the task of culturing the bacteria to be infected, to be injected into a chicken to see how the disease was transmitted. So he set up the experiment, and he set up his culture dish and added the bacteria, but he took a vacation. He didn't think it would matter. He thought, well, I come back. By that time, the bacteria will have multiplied even better, and we'll go on with the experiment. So it took a couple of weeks, and when he came back, he took the culture, and he gave it to Pasteur, and Pasteur injected this into a chicken, and it had no effect. It had no effect. So what had happened here? Of course, someone else might have just thought, gee, maybe we did something wrong. Originally it wasn't the right bacteria. We'd have thrown out the whole thing and just repeated the experiment. But he thought about it, and he thought maybe the time that had passed had done something to the bacteria and inactivated it. But then came an even more interesting observation. I mean, he had these chickens, who had been, inoculated and were unaffected. He wasn't going to get rid of these chickens. But in order to do the experiment again, he took some fresh bacteria, because that was supposed to be the original experiment. Take fresh bacteria, inject it into chickens, see what would happen. So he cultured some bacteria, injected into the chicken, and it turned out that the chickens survived. And then he made the real classic experiment. He took the same culture of bacteria and injected it into another batch of chickens that had not previously been inoculated with the time-passed bacteria, and those chickens died. So, what was the conclusion to come to here? That having left those bacteria for a period of time did something to the bacteria. It somehow made them inactive so that they didn't cause disease. However, it still stimulated the immune system of the chicken so that the next time a live bacterium was introduced, it was immune to it. So this was an example of immunology, a vaccine potential, right? You introduce an inactive form of the bacteria to the chickens, and then they become immune to the fresh bacteria. And indeed, it became a business, and vaccines made from this chicken cholera powder that was extracted from the blood of chickens, and it worked. The bacterium eventually was named after Pasteur, because of course he had done this experiment, and Pasteur, with this experiment, saved the French chicken industry. But it also allowed him to think about treating other conditions the same way. And indeed, Pasteur eventually developed a vaccine for anthrax and for rabies. He was really the originator of vaccines. He coined the word vaccine himself. The word vaccine comes from Latin for cow, and that's because the original vaccine against smallpox 100 years before was by taking pustules from milkmaids who had become immune to a disease very similar to smallpox called cowpox, and that protected them against smallpox. So because this originally came from a cow, Pasteur coined the term vaccination for it. So it's a classic story of serendipity, because the lucky thing was that he went on a vacation, leaving the bacteria there for about two weeks. Had that not happened, Pasteur would have never been able to carry out that experiment. Another lucky discovery, which is perhaps the most famous of all the chance discoveries, was one made by Alexander Fleming in 1928. Fleming was a bacteriologist. He was studying bacteria, and he was interested in finding substances that could destroy bacteria. He was interested in tears, saliva, which might have some bacterial effect. Anyway, so he cultured bacteria in a dish, and he went away for the weekend. So sometimes it's good for scientists to take a break. You never know where it's going to lead. Came back and looked at his Petri dish, and he saw that a mold had grown in it. Now, most people would have looked at that and said, hell, this experiment has gone haywire, I'm going to get rid of it. Moldy, right? But Pasteur looked at it carefully, and he noticed that around the periphery of the mold, the bacteria had died. Classic lucky observation. He wasn't able to isolate whatever had killed the bacteria. And this is sometimes misunderstood, even when people teach the history of bacteriology. He made the original observation, this is true, without which, of course, the nothing else would have happened. But he was never able to isolate the substance that we now know as penicillin. It was 10 years later that Florey and Chain in England were finally able to grow enough of this mold to isolate from it the active ingredient, which of course turned out to be penicillin. And this was in 1941. So this was quite a bit after Fleming had made the original observation. But penicillin changed the course of the war because the Allies had it, the Germans did not. The Germans suffered from all kinds of bacterial diseases that could be controlled by penicillin. Penicillin, of course, also was a cure for gonorrhea, which was a widespread disease during the war. And eventually, this led to the Nobel Prize for Fleming, Chain, and Florey. And again, they never worked together, okay? But it is true that Florey and Chain would have never been able to isolate penicillin from the penicillium mold had Fleming not made his original observation. So this is why the Nobel Prize was divided among the three. And as you know, 3 is the maximum divisions that can be made for the Nobel Prize. So once again, we have penicillin, one of the most important drugs ever discovered. It was discovered by chance. Today, of course, it is made in huge batches. It is still one of the most widely used antibiotics, and it is made in these gigantic containers and is made by what we call fermentation technology. And that is actually what was going on in Fleming's Petri dish. Fermentation refers to the use of a living organism that can be fed some nutrient, usually sugar or starch, that will then crank out useful substances. So these giant containers contain the penicillin mold plus sugar solution, and the mold converts the sugar into penicillin, which is then isolated. All right, let's get to our next lucky discovery. And this takes us to another devastating disease, which is malaria. Malaria is still horrific today. It still affects millions of people, kills hundreds of thousands, but you don't hear much about it because, of course, it doesn't happen here. It happens in Africa, in Asia. Malaria is still terrible, and it is, of course, transmitted by the bite of a mosquito. The malaria, the disease, is caused by a parasite. And it is a parasite that grows in blood. So the mosquito is just a vector. The mosquito sucks blood from one person, and if it happens to bite another one, it can carry this parasite. The parasite, as you can see here, grows in the blood, and it destroys red blood cells, which is what causes the problems of malaria. Incidentally, the reason it's called malaria is also interesting. It comes from the Latin, bad air, because it used to be thought that it was bad air that caused malaria, because malaria, of course, is widely seen around swampy areas where mosquitoes live, which is also where you tend to have a lot of bad air. So it was thought that that was the cause. And of course, that name has been retained. Malaria had, however, a possible cure that was introduced into Europe from South America once Columbus had come and followed by others, and they learned to speak with the natives, get some experience from the natives, and they learned from Peruvian natives that the disease, of course they didn't call it malaria, but it was, could be treated with the bark of a tree that grew in Peru, called Peruvian bark. The Jesuits, who had gone to South America to convert the natives to Christianity, learned about this from the natives, and they introduced the bark into Europe, where it was very often referred to as Jesuit bark. and it was widely accepted in Catholic Europe, but it wasn't accepted in Protestant England because of the name. And they didn't want anything to do with something that had been imported by the Jesuits. And Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector in England, was actually struck by malaria, but he would not take Jesuit bark because he said he'd rather go to a Protestant heaven than live in a Catholic hell on earth. It was interesting. Anyway, Peruvian bark comes from a tree that obviously grows in Peru. Actually, if you look at the Peruvian flag, it has the cinchona tree on it. And you can strip the bark of the tree. Now, however the natives learned about this, I mean, you know, we can only guess. But before modern medicine, if you were sick, what could you possibly do? You would try to eat something. You'd try herbs, and usually you died. But if something worked, then of course the story got told, and you know, over the many years, there were some things that made it into the medical armamentarium. And one of those was Peruvian bark, or Jesuit bark. Now, they didn't know it at that time, but today, of course, we know that the active ingredient in that bark is quinine. And quinine actually is still used today in some places for treating malaria, although there are better drugs that are available today. All right, well, what's this got to do with lucky discoveries? A great deal. The lucky part of this story takes us to Victorian England and the discovery of the first synthetic dye, which was mauve, discovered by William Henry Perkin in 1856. Now, we're talking here Victorian era, right? Victorian era, when you see the dates, the date is not the life of Queen Victoria, it's the time that she reigned. She ascended to the throne in 1837 and died in 1901. She was the longest reigning British monarch until Elizabeth came along, who, of course, was the longest reigning British monarch. Anyway, at that time, during the Victorian era, Justus von Liebig, who was one of the most famous German scientists at that time, chemist, came to England on a lecture tour. And he said that England is not the land of science. There's only widespread dilettantism. Their chemists are ashamed to be known by that name because it has been assumed by the apothecaries who are despised. Well, England, to say England was not the land of science was really, you know, England was the land of Newton. England was the land of Michael Faraday, of Humphrey Davy, of John Dalton, Robert Boyle, some of the most famous scientists ever. So this was sort of German arrogance. Although, of course, Germans, specifically in chemistry, probably were at the forefront. Anyway, this is what Liebig said, and this did not go down well with Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's husband. He actually was of German origin, right? Albert was, but he was fiercely British, right, after he had married the Queen. And he decided that he had to do something to improve the pursuit of chemistry in Britain. He didn't want the Germans saying these things like what Liebig said. But in order to improve the practice and teaching of chemistry in England, he thought that the best idea would be to import someone from Germany, someone who had actually studied under Liebig. And he did. And that was August Wilhelm Hofmann, who happened to be one of Liebig's better students. And he was invited by Prince Albert to come to England to set up what came to be called the Royal College of Chemistry. And this was the first time that there was an institution that was devoted totally to studying chemistry. Now, this was mostly for senior students who had already gone to university, but now wanted to learn about chemistry, wanted to specialize. But one day, a young boy, who at that time was only 18 years old, William Henry Perkin, knocked on the door and wanted to join the institute. And Hoffman said, no, I mean, you know, this is for students who already have some expertise in science. But I guess he was very persistent, Perkin was, and he said he was willing to do anything, was willing to wash glassware. He just wanted to have some experience with chemistry. And I guess he talked a good game, and Hoffman finally agreed, and he joined the group. And here he is, remarkable picture. Here is Hoffman. This is sometime 1855, and there's young Perkin. The others, as you can see, are older. At first, he really didn't do anything serious. Indeed, it turned out that he was just washing glassware and helping the other students. But one of the things that Hoffman was interested in was the bark of the cinchona tree. Now, in those days, chemistry was still rather primitive, but they were able to determine molecular composition. So he was able to isolate a white powder from cinchona bark, which eventually turned out to be quinine, and found its formula. Now, they didn't know anything about how those atoms were put together. They didn't know anything about structural formula of molecules, but they were able to determine the relative amount of the different elements in it. And so he was interested in this, Hoffman was. And he knew that there was a substance that could be isolated from coal tar, the tar that is left behind after coal burns, that was called aniline. This had been isolated from coal tar. And he was interested in this because he had determined the composition of this, and it seemed to have similar to that of quinine, except for one thing. It didn't have any oxygen in it. So, in 1856, the Easter holidays rolled around, and the institute was going to be closed for 2 weeks, holiday. And Perkin went to Hoffman and he said, is there anything I can do at home, because I really don't want to be without chemistry for 2 weeks? And of course, this is very understandable. And Hoffman said, no, go and relax. But Perkin insisted. And Hoffman finally said, all right, why don't you try to synthesize some quinine? It was an impossible task, as of course we now know. But it seemed reasonable at the time, because aniline had a composition similar to quinine, except it didn't have any oxygen. So Hoffman suggested to young Perkin to use an oxidizing agent, that is a chemical that would add oxygen to the molecule. Today, of course, we know the molecular structure of quinine. It is a very complicated molecular structure. They had absolutely no chance of synthesizing this in the lab in 1856. In fact, it was finally done only 1944 by Robert Woodward, who was the greatest synthetic chemist who has ever lived, Nobel Prize winner. And in 1944, he was able to synthesize quinine. Now, the synthesis of quinine actually in the laboratory had no practical importance, because quinine could be quite easily extracted from the bark of the tree. And the synthesis of quinine took something like 98 steps, and eventually he ended up with less than a milligram after having started with mountains of raw material. So no, it had no practical significance, except for the fact that all of the chemical reactions that were developed in order to make quinine eventually found use elsewhere. I mean, this is why organic chemists synthesize complex molecules, not because you need them, one of the most classic syntheses is that of vitamin B12. We don't need to synthesize vitamin B12. It's readily available in all kinds of foods. But the task of making such a complex molecule really is challenging. And you develop all kinds of steps, all kinds of reactions to do that, which then can be used elsewhere. So anyway, back to 1856. So Perkin goes home, and in his basement, he sets up a laboratory, and he begins to investigate the possibility of making quinine. He takes aniline, and he tries oxidizing agents. Nothing works. He keeps ending up with gums and dirty things, and very difficult to wash out. And one day, he couldn't wash out his glassware just with water, so he rinsed it with alcohol. He poured alcohol in, and all of a sudden, it turned into a beautiful color that he had never seen before. And this was the birth of mauve, the first ever synthetic dye. What was the lucky accident here? Well, two things. One, that he rinsed it out with alcohol, but that wasn't the key thing. The key was that the aniline that he had used was contaminated. Aniline will never form the mauve with the oxidizing agents, but the aniline he used was contaminated with another chemical also found in coal tar called allyl-toluidine. And that is what allowed the reaction to turn to mauve. And mauve became extremely popular. Victorian era was dominated by purple. Everyone loved it, especially because the Queen herself loved the purple color. Postage stamps were colored mauve. Indeed, the decade after the discovery was called the Mauve Decade. And for about 10 years, the penny royals, as they are called, were colored with mauve. If any of you have a penny royal, I'll take it. Very hard to find. Very hard to find. Perkin made so much money because he recognized that he had made a discovery. He borrowed money from his father, who had some funds, and he built a factory where he started to produce mauve, which took the world by storm. He didn't need to try to find job. He had plenty of money from the factory, but he continued his chemistry. And even later on, he developed a reaction called the Perkin reaction, which we still use today in organic chemistry. He became the elder statesman of chemistry in this classic portrait, which hangs in the Portrait Gallery in London. You see him holding a piece of silk dyed with mauve. In 1906, he was invited to come to the United States to be the first recipient of the Perkin Medal, which is bestowed on a chemist every year since then, generally an industrial chemist who has made some very important contribution. It's not quite a Nobel Prize, but it's not too far removed from it. And he was the first recipient. And for years, the Perkin Medal was given out at a dinner at a restaurant in New York called Delmonico's. Sometimes it's still there, but it does move around the country now. And only the hierarchy of the scientific establishment are invited to this dinner. And gentlemen in the invitation are sent a bow tie that is colored with mauve. And the interesting thing about this is that it is colored with a sample of mauve from the original 1856 batch. Because when Perkin came in 1906, he left a sample of the original mauve at Columbia University. And every year they take out a little bit. It's a very potent dye, so you don't need very much. They dye some silk from which they make the bow ties. And now ladies are invited too. They get a scarf that is colored with mauve. And again, this would not have happened had it not been for that accident where the aniline was contaminated with toluidine. This launched the whole dye industry because, of course, if you could make one kind of color, you could make others. And indeed, synthetic chemists got into the game, and all kinds of dyes were made from coal tar. They're still today called the coal tar dyes. The Friedrich Bayer company was originally founded as a dye manufacturer. And that was long before it became famous as a pharmaceutical company, right? Today, of course, Bayer, the Bayer cross on aspirin is what the company is famous for. But that only happened after it had started as a dye manufacturer. Now, therein lies another fascinating story, another story of a lucky discovery. This takes us back to 1886, when in a German medical journal, a paper appeared by Drs. Arnold Kahn and Paul Hepp, and the paper started out, "A lucky accident dropped the medicine into our hands." That's how it started. What was this lucky accident? The two had diagnosed a patient with intestinal worms. Not a pleasant disease to have, but in those days, intestinal worms were relatively common because, of course, people weren't so fastidious about cleanliness. So intestinal worms were pretty common, and there was a treatment in those days. And the treatment was naphthalene. Now, naphthalene is the same stuff that you've heard of, which is used in mothballs, because it is indeed an effective insecticide. Well, that worm is just a large insect. So naphthalene actually was a decent drug to use against intestinal worms. However, as luck would have it, the chemist who dispensed this medication made a mistake. And instead of naphthalene, he gave the patient acetanilide. Why did the chemist have acetanilide in the first place? Why would they be stocking this? They were stocking this because all chemicals that derived from aniline, as acetanilide did, it's a derivative of aniline, were of great interest in those days, because Perkin had already shown how you could make a novel substance, the mauve dye, from coal tar. And aniline, of course, was found in coal tar. So there was a great deal of interest in anything that was made from aniline, because this could be the raw material to make other materials. Anyway, as one would suspect, the acetanilide did nothing for the patient's worms. However, it did do something for the patient's fever. The fever went way down. Now, that was an interesting observation, because intestinal worms often trigger fever. So anyway, the fever went down, the worms kept frolicking, but this was interesting. And now there was another chance, another piece of luck that entered the picture. The brother of one of the physicians who had prescribed the supposed naphthalene, but actually turned out to be acetanilide, worked for a pharmaceutical company. He worked for a company called the Calais Chemical Company, which is actually still around today. And he told his brother about having found that this substance, acetanilide, because they eventually found out, of course, that the wrong prescription had been given, that this reduced fever. And that really intrigued the company. They did some further experiments and saw that this really was the case. It reduced fever. And they put it on the market, calling it antifebrin, antifebrile, right? That's where the name comes from. It was the first medicine that was effective at reducing fever. Well, quinine did that too, but quinine was specific for malaria, fever induced by malaria. Antifebrin worked for any kind of fever. However, they didn't know it right away, but eventually it turned out that antifebrin also interfered with the ability of the blood to transport oxygen. But at that time, of course, that wasn't apparent. But it became at first a very successful drug because it was the first one that could reduce fever. And it came to the attention of Carl Duisberg, who was the chief chemist at the Friedrich Bayer Company, which, remember, I told you was a dye manufacturer at that time. But he was impressed by the fact that this compound acetanilide reduced fever. But of course, they had the company that originally produced acetanilide had a patent on it. So he was bent on discovering something else that could work. And he knew that because of their dye manufacturing process, they had a lot of waste material. And one of those wastes was a compound called nitrophenol. Of course, he knew chemistry. He knew nitrophenol was close to acetanilide in its chemical composition. So he thought that this could be used to try to make some compounds that could reduce fever. And they made a number of these, and one of them turned out to be very successful. And it hit the market as phenacetin. And when it was combined with caffeine, it was even better. So this now was being highly promoted, and by this time, it had come to light that acetanilide had this problem with the blood. Phenacetin did not. So it was much advertised as being superior to acetanilide. Eventually, it would turn out that this had kidney issues. But again, they didn't know that at the time. But the promotion was that unlike acetanilide, it did not interfere with the blood's ability to transport oxygen. So it was widely sold, phenacetin. It was a very popular remedy up until the 1940s, when an interesting observation was made, 1947. And that was that both acetanilide and phenacetin, both of which reduce fever, but they did it for the same reason. Because in the body, they were both converted to the same compound. We call that a metabolite. So in the body, whether you started with acetanilide or whether you started with phenacetin, the body converted it to acetaminophen, and that was the actual active ingredient. That's what reduced the fever. You might recognize acetaminophen as Tylenol. And it started to be sold in the 1950s. Because why should you use this or that when they both convert to the active ingredient in the body? So why not just produce the active ingredient, which is, of course, exactly what was done. And Tylenol became a very popular drug, and it still is. It relieves pain, it reduces fever, it does not reduce inflammation. So it's not an NSAID, it's not a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory like ibuprofen or aspirin, but it is effective against pain and against fever. But there's a big but here. And the big but is that it leads to acute liver failure, and you don't have to exceed the recommended dose by much. This is something that is very important to keep in mind. You don't ever want to take more than 4 grams of acetaminophen a day, and you certainly don't want to be taking that dose for a period of time. It accounts for about 50% of all liver toxicity cases in North America, all liver failure, and accounts for 50% of all liver transplants. Now, not all of these liver toxic issues are due to the accidental overdose. I mean, there's a lot of accidental overdose. You know, people think that if a little bit is good, more is better. So they keep taking more. Unfortunately, it is also the prime drug that is used in attempted suicides. And it's a major issue. Now, the science behind it, of what happens here and what to do about toxicity is also very interesting. When you ingest acetaminophen, the body, of course, recognizes it as a foreign substance and wants to get rid of it. And the prime way that the body tries to handle it is by attaching a molecule of glucuronic acid or of sulfate to it. This makes it soluble, eliminates it from the body. However, if you've taken too much acetaminophen, these will not be enough to do the job. And then what happens is another enzyme called cytochrome steps in, and it converts acetaminophen into a metabolite that is highly toxic. And that is what causes the liver damage. However, we know how that happens, and we know what to do about it. Because the body has supportive mechanisms. And the body produces a chemical called glutathione, which can eliminate the toxic material. So if someone overdoses on acetaminophen, what you need to do is to increase the amount of glutathione. But although glutathione can easily be made in the lab, you cannot take it orally. It cannot survive digestion. However, N-acetylcysteine will make glutathione in the body. N-acetylcysteine releases an amino acid called cysteine, which is the critical one to make glutathione. This is why every emergency room in every hospital stocks N-acetylcysteine. And when someone is diagnosed with acetaminophen overdose, which happens often, I know these numbers because my daughter is an emergency physician, and there's no week that goes by without having to use N-acetylcysteine. And it works 97% of the time. So it's a very, very effective drug. It saves lives. And what is interesting is that, you know, we now know the mechanism, but also, of course, the backstory is interesting on the development of acetaminophen, which all was based on a chance discovery. So without the N-acetylcysteine, the toxic metabolite would build up, and that leads to death. Okay, I give you one final fascinating, lucky story. And this takes us back to the 19th century, an Italian chemist by the name of Michele Pironi. He discovered a drug, which of course he didn't realize at the time was a drug, called cisplatin. In 1844, in the laboratory, he just reacted platinum with ammonia and chlorine and isolated a substance called cisplatin. He didn't do anything with it, except that he did write down that he had made this. He would have never dreamed that in the future, this would become one of the prime anti-cancer drugs. Anyway, Pironi was trained as a physician, but then he saw the light and he decided to turn to chemistry. But he wanted to have very good education. And in those days, France was very prominent. Of course, this was, during the era of Lavoisier. French science was very strong. And one of the most famous French chemists was Jean-Baptiste André Dumas. And Pironi approached him to work in his lab, and he did. And in Dumas' lab, he learned proper laboratory techniques. He became a very adept chemist, but he wanted to further his knowledge, and of course that meant you had to go to Germany in those days, because as I said, Germany really was at the forefront. And he managed to get Justus von Liebig, who we mentioned before, to allow him to work in his lab. And it did. And it was in Liebig's lab that Pironi first made this compound, cisplatin, but he did nothing with it. It was just recorded that this could be made. And in fact, nothing happened with this compound until 1965, when Barnett Rosenberg at Michigan State University was carrying out experiments that had absolutely nothing to do with medicine. He was investigating the effect of electric fields on bacteria. He wanted to see what happens if you take bacteria, you put them in solution, and you put electrodes into that solution, you pass current from one electrode to the other. He was just interested in what that would do. He happened to be using platinum electrodes. And the bacteria he was using was E. coli, which is a very common type of bacterium. And what he noticed is that the bacteria stopped multiplying. And he thought, you know, this is interesting. I mean, it was not totally unexpected. You know, I mean, you put a charge across a human, they will stop, right? So it wasn't so surprising that something happened to the bacteria. However, it turned out that when the electrodes were made of other metals, not platinum, but copper or carbon, the bacteria kept multiplying. Well, this seemed pretty interesting. Again, most people would have just thought, you know, well, you know, this is bizarre. Let me go on to do some other experiment. But he thought about it, and he studied it further. And of course, it turned out that by passing the electric current through this solution, the platinum had reacted with some of the components of the solution which contain nutrients for the bacterium, including chlorine and ammonia, and that this formed the cisplatin. And this, of course, is where the Pasteur motto of chance favors a prepared mind comes in. Because again, you know, most people probably would not have known what to do with this, but he started thinking, since these platinum electrodes prevented the E. coli from multiplying, might they also prevent cancer cells from multiplying? Very logical, right? So he isolated the cisplatin and started to work with mice, and indeed found that tumors in mice regressed, published this. This came to the attention of the National Cancer Institute in 1972. They funded trials of cisplatin. And it was very quickly discovered that it was effective. The first cancer that it was really found to be effective against was testicular cancer. And in 1978, it was approved for that treatment. And soon after, it was approved for lung, bladder, cervical, ovarian cancer, for which it's still used, but it has been joined by other platinum compounds. Because this is the usual thing. When you find something that works, you try to find something that works better. So today, there's still a lot of activity on trying to find platinum compounds that are better than cisplatin for the treatment of cancer. So cisplatin was obviously the result of serendipity. The fact that the platinum electrode and no other electrode had this effect on cells. However, it was the wisdom of Rosenberg to capitalize on this. He made the observation, and then he came to the proper conclusion. So you can see that sometimes chance, luck, plays a very important role in the discovery process. But as Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. You have to know what to do with that observation. So, there are plenty of other stories like this in the history of science. We have some of them on our website. You can check it out. But, it's always interesting to look behind the story to see how something evolved. And very often, it's not a straightforward road. It's a very curvy road. And very often, there's luck that is involved in discoveries. All right, well, that's our story for today. And you have any questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. No, coal tar is very complex chemically. There are hundreds of chemicals in coal tar. So, the more research just stimulated looking into all of the others. And so eventually numerous dyes were made from the different compounds that are found in coal tar. Still are today. I mean, coal tar and petroleum is still the #1 source for dyes. Yeah. It is dangerous, but it's a classic example of only the dose makes the poison. So when we said 4 grams is the maximum dose, I mean most people don't take 4 grams. Well, let me make sure this is clear. 4 grams is not the recommended dose. 4 grams is the maximum dose, and most people don't take more than 2 grams. A tablet usually has 500 milligrams, so 4 tablets a day. With that, there's minimal risk, unless you're drinking alcohol. Alcohol and Tylenol should never, ever be mixed. See, I told you that acetaminophen, the active ingredient, is not the real problem. It's the metabolite. That's the problem. Well, the reaction to convert acetaminophen into the dangerous metabolite is speeded up with alcohol. So many of the accidental cases of Tylenol poisoning are due to consuming alcohol concurrently. Many of the other accidental cases are due to the lack of realization that acetaminophen is found in many other over-the-counter remedies. So it's not only in labeled Tylenol. There are a number of cold remedies which have acetaminophen as an active ingredient. So unless you overdose, it's a good drug. No, not at 1 gram a day. No, but at 4 grams a day, yes. Yeah. You don't want to be taking 4 grams of Tylenol. Also, I think the pain relieving effect of Tylenol, I think, is also overstated. I don't think it's quite as good a pain reliever as the ads tell you. Yeah. Yes. Acetaminophen is acetaminophen no matter what you call it. Yeah. Generic acetaminophen is the same. Oh yeah, of course you buy the cheaper. Yeah. Yes. Well, the reason it's behind the counter is because of the codeine, right? Good. Yeah. No, I don't. No, codeine doesn't increase the danger of the acetaminophen. It just adds the danger of the codeine. Well, when you never have more than 500 milligrams of acetaminophen in combination with the codeine. So there's no synergistic effect there. It's just codeine itself has side effects. So yes, both caffeine and codeine add to the pain-killing effect. Yeah. So acetaminophen in combination with codeine kills pain more, of course. Yeah. But then you also have the problem of constipation from the codeine. Yeah. As long as you stay within the recommended dose. Yeah, as long as you stay within the recommended dose of each one. You have to realize, though, that ibuprofen, Advil, has the same issues as aspirin. Yeah, you get gas. Yes. Yeah. Yes, there is a synergistic effect, yes, between ibuprofen and Advil, and acetaminophen. Yeah. What? Yeah, so I think, yeah, you can get ibuprofen and acetaminophen in the same pill. Yeah. Mold? Well, there's thousands of different kinds of mold. Okay, you cannot tell by looking. Okay, that you have to have it analyzed to see what it is. Most molds that grow on food are not toxic. The ones that grow on your walls in the basement after a flood, that's a different story. All right, we'll see you next month.